Well, good afternoon. Looks like my picture is a little off here, so I hope that not that you need to see me, but that you can see the slides are okay, and I think you can. We're going to do chapter 7 and 8 tonight. Chapter 7, organization change, research and theory, and then chapter 8, conceptual models for understanding organization change. Now, Burke introduces work that was done by Friedlander and Brown in 1974. And notice that he's talking about it here being in the annual review of psychology. So organization change isn't just for business. It has some other underpinnings, as we talked about before, and it's not just found in what we might consider hard sciences. Notice that down here at the bottom, the conclusion of their research, and by the way, we have a chart to show next. The conclusion of their research was that techno, I'll get it here in a second. Techno structural change research was more definitive than human procedural research. I changed that last word a little bit easier. We think about it that way. What that simply means is that it's easier to measure. And the reason it's easier to measure is because we're dealing with something that's concrete. Human procedures, human processes, way humans do things, we have a lot of data on that. But the data, I won't say the data is not conclusive. I think the thing that the data is that humans don't fit into neat boxes. And so you can't put them in a box and tie a string around them and put a nice bow on that and say, here you are, here's human behavior, here's human culture, et cetera, et cetera. We tend to change based upon our needs. And so that's all that really is saying there. And I don't think that's something that you should confuse or fool anybody, but it's something that you can see. This is figure 7.1 in your text. We have two dimensions here. We have people at the upper side and technology down here at the bottom, and we have organizational processes at the top. And then we have the structures down at the bottom, which again, it's something that's hard and fast. We can do something with it. And then we see the dotted lines here. We have human fulfillment. Excuse me a second here. Human fulfillment obviously impacting on organizational structures and vice versa, and then organizational processes impacting on task accomplishment and vice versa. Not something I think here we should be surprised about, but it's something that we may not think of all the time. We might think that, again, going back to something I've said before, that we can absolutely measure the human condition. And I think we can approximate the human condition pretty well. And we could get pretty close to it, but we can't always put it in parameters like we can other things. Now, Burke moves on to discuss the Alderfer's review. Notice what he says here, more rigor and vigor, but what's problematic about Alderfer's work is he didn't use a framework. So Alderfer, now, when I say this, and I think when Burke says it, but not so much what I say, but more what Burke says, but I want to try to make the point here. Burke was saying that his work is important, even though it wasn't within a certain particular framework. And so that was, we can still see that there's a lot to that, as opposed to saying, well, since it's not in a framework, we're not going to pay attention to Pardon me. Fauché et al. In 1982 concluded that Friedlander's work, Friedlander and Brown's model of human processes outcomes was unsubstantiated. And that brings us back to the point that we made earlier, that we really can't put humans in an easy place and say, okay, this is it, and they don't go past these dimensions. We know better than that. We may not always think that. We may think, well, boy, we can typecast this person or typecast that person, and so if we typecast this person or that person, and they belong to a certain group, but then we can typecast everybody in that group, and we know that that's a fallacy. We can't do that. And although many try, it's impossible to do that. And we humans have consistently done that to each other people, and that's, we can use the words bias or prejudice or something else to say that, but we're making assumptions based on the few and trying to extrapolate that to the many. That's just not a good practice. Now here, Burke refers to the work of Beer and Walton, and they found problems with the normal science approach. Notice that it studies only isolated and episodic events. Now, I would say to you that if it only studies isolated events, they probably tend to be episodic. Why? Well, if you would study an isolated event and it's the same as a previous isolated event that you may have studied, why study it? Why even report it? Because it's the same that you found before. And so I contend that, and I may be wrong by the way, I contend that an isolated event tends to be episodic. Involves users in the study. Now here, the point here is that if the people in the study are actually into this thing, that's going to change it, and it's not going to take a very objective viewpoint. Go back to the Hawthorne studies. And we noticed that people who were in the studies acted differently because they knew they were being watched, if you will, observed, better word to use. And all this means that if people in this, the users are in the study, then there's going to be some differences here, and you're not controlling for the variable. And again, here it occurs over time and not episodically. So I skipped one because I think that's fairly self-evident. So if it occurs over time and not episodically, then that goes back to hopefully to make my point that isolated events tend to be episodic, because you wouldn't isolate something that's a run-of-the-mill, everyday, mundane type of event or change. You just simply wouldn't do that. It doesn't make any sense. Why try to spend time explaining something that it happens repetitively? It's a waste of time and energy. Pardon me. Now, Burke goes on and talks about having issues with normal science approach. So let's look at these. Research. If you're going to use, if people are going to be actively participating and they're going to be studied as well, and they know that, then notice there that the research can affect the outcome. So if you have a scientific approach where it's more, and I hate to use this term, but I kind of have to try to make the point, it's more of a hands-off type thing. Now, not that the research is hands-off, but you don't have participants doing the research as well. then it's more objective. Then it's more of a, I can stand back and I can observe this, and I'm not manipulating anything here, any of the participants, et cetera. Now, yeah, sometimes when you're in uh, the uh, research, you're manipulating the variables because you're trying to find an outcome. But in manipulating the variables doesn't mean that you're necessarily taking part in the research itself. That's kind of difficult to think about. If I'm manipulating variables, I'm not actually taking part in the research. Well, no, because I'm just manipulating the variable to see what will happen. I'm not actually participating in the research. I'm only manipulating the variable. I'm doing that to see if my hypothesis is going to hold true or it's going to be negated. If you get into evaluative research, it's a lot more subjective. Now, this is what we're talking about down here, selecting the right dependent variable. What might change? In other words, you manipulate the independent variable to see if the dependent variable will change. Notice what he says here is tricky. There's no question about that, especially when self-reported data is used. So you have to be, or data are used, data is plural, I forgot about that. So you have to be careful about that as well. Now he mentions Sventek et al. In 1997 research on organizational change, arguing for a complex systems approach. Well, wouldn't you think we ought to do that? I mean, if we're talking about humans who are going to be involved in the change, we have a complex organism. So we ought to think about doing something that is a more complex systems approach to organizational resource change. And notice, because complex behavior requires understanding that the variables determining the behavior. In other words, the behavior doesn't determine the variable, but the variable determines the behavior. And then the connections between the variables, if there are any, and then the patterns that are associated in the interconnections. And of course, those interconnections can change. And then once that changes, we're going to have some changes because of the length of time, et cetera, et cetera. Now, again, with the more recent approaches, again, Sventek, I think that's probably a better way to pronounce that, and Brown proposed two nonlinear concepts. They have the phase space and then the attractors. And here we're talking about what we are and how what we are makes a difference. And Burke uses a pretty good way to show this of two banks in New York. Both had been in business about the same length of time. I think as I remember from the text, it's about 140 years. They had about the same number of employees and assets, et cetera, et cetera. But the characteristics of the two were much different. Bank A tended to be a little bit riskier. Now, riskier, what I mean is the types of loans it would do, the type of things of that nature, and how it approached its business. Where Bank B was the prototype that we tend to think of bankers being staid and conservative and not going out on a limb when they make loans and things of that nature. And so it took, and he mentions, and we're going to talk more about this in chapter 11, but he mentions that, pardon me, it took quite a good amount of time for these two banks to actually merge their two cultures. Now, he uses, and I think it's important to think about this as you're looking at that information in this particular chapter, and then when we get to chapter 11. This was a merger, and it was a merger of equals. Different philosophies, different cultures, different ways of doing business, but they were equals. Now, one bank did not buy out the other bank. It was not an acquisition. It was a merger of equals. And so what I would say to you here is, and this was, they're going to have to go through a change process. Someone or someones before the merger occurred didn't do due diligence to see the dichotomy that was being, the dichotomy that was, and how they were going to have to bring that together to mesh. And then he goes on here to talk about characteristics, sensitivity to initial conditions, history being one, and then stability being the other. And he talked about working with a colleague who kept saying, I don't need to hear about the history. I'm not interested in the history. And yet we have to remember that it is a history of a company, its stability, and that's what the history is. History being different, stability being culture. Obviously, the history starts and the culture is developed along that line. And the culture comes from the values and the culture itself instilled by the founder or founders of the organization. So it's very important to know that. It's like knowing the underpinnings. It's like understanding your family. Almost all of us in the United States, with the exception of Native Americans, and I don't know what percent of the population that is, are immigrants to this country. Now, certainly the Native Americans are too, because they came from Asia across the Bering Strait when there was a bridge, a land bridge there. So we could consider them immigrants as well, but let's not take that. We'll say, okay, they were the first human settlers here, so they weren't immigrants in the term that we think of immigrants. So we have to understand our family and why we do certain things that we do, what groups that we belong to, how we interact with our fellows. That's based upon our historical impact. That's, as he says here, initial conditions. And then that grows and becomes our culture. And sometimes that culture gets twisted. And we don't, and I don't mean that to be bad, but it gets twisted. And a very good example of that today, actually yesterday, it's not actually the anniversary, but the anniversary of the Easter Rebellion in Ireland, which was actually 1916 and happened in April, Easter Sunday being in April that year, and then what started on Monday. And I read a very good article about it in the New York Times over the weekend, and a lot of people are saying the Irish, or some parts of the Irish, not all parts of the Irish, they should not champion that Easter Rebellion, because even though they were striking a blow for liberty, they didn't stop and think about what they were doing. It wasn't organized as well as it should have been. They had no chance in what they were setting up to do against the British. And then, of course, I mean, there were some other horrific things that happened. I'm not getting into that, but I'm talking about here's a culture that lionizes the Easter Rebellion, and probably for the wrong reasons. And the wrong reasons are what tend to resonate as opposed to something else. So that's what we're talking about. Excuse me, I skipped over a slide, and I apologize for that. So let's get back here. This is a work that was done by Porras and Robinson. Now here he's talking about plan change, unplanned change, first order change, second order change. And we've discussed planned and unplanned change before. Planned change tends to be something that we've thought about for a period of time, and we're trying to improve processes or products or the way we do things, not necessarily processes, pardon me, which would be part of processes there, but also possibly the training of the people who are doing certain things, employees. Unplanned, we know, is usually a response to something that's happened outside our operating environment. Now, when I'm using the term here, operating environment, I'm talking about within. I'm not talking about outside. He goes on here to talk about first order change and uses the Japanese term Kaizen, which is continuous improvement. And we know that the Japanese, especially in their automobile manufacturing, because we know that probably a little bit better as consumers, we might know some of their other things. And that's not to say that the other things that they do within their industries aren't important. We just happen to probably know about the, pardon me, about the automobile industry a little bit better, their automobile industry a little bit better. Their piece of the automobile industry being global. That they're continually working to improve things. And yes, that's changed, but it's not changed in the we think of it in perhaps in the macro sense. Now, notice that first order change would be equated to, at least in my mind, with plan change. And then he talks here about second order change being revolutionary, and that would probably be unplanned change. Now, that's not to say that planned change cannot be revolutionary. Please don't think I said that. I don't mean to say that. I don't mean to leave the impression with you that revolutionary change cannot be planned change. It can be. We don't tend to think of it that way. We tend to think of unplanned change as being revolutionary and planned change as being in a continuous mode. Now, this just gives you an example of what Porras and his colleagues were saying, and with first order and second order change here. And then notice they used developmental as in planned, and then in the second order change, they use transformational. Transformational, yes, correct. I confused myself. Transformational change. Notice that they're showing that underneath planned. So that comes back to the point I was trying to make before, that revolutionary change can be planned, but it probably has to follow with the word transformational, transform. So we're going to transform something. It's not the transactional that we think of that kind of goes from day to day. This is just going back to and bringing up Porras's model here. Notice here he's talking about the input, the transformation, and output model. We know that model in many things. Bringing a company brings in raw material, puts it through a transformation process, and then produces a product, the output at the end. And notice what he says, they're highlighting work setting elements and members. And then this particular slide, I'm going to try to blow this up just a little bit for you. This is figure 7.2. you can see this in the text, but I'm going to blow it up anyway. And this gives us the parameters in which we work. We see the environment here, and then work settings and members being employees, the organization, of course, within the environment. And then we have organizational performance and individual development. And of course, they interact with each other. Notice we have such things here as on-the-job behavior. Those are the members, individual cognitions here. And then we come up here to the vision. We're showing such other things that for technology, organizing arrangements, that would be structure, social factors, etc. This gives you a little bit more graphic idea of what Porras and his colleagues were trying to get at. Now, this is, come back here so you can see this slide here a little better. Adequate theories include Whetten. Remember, and we have to go back to this, that Burke was saying that he's using things that he thinks are important. And Burke admits, and I think we talked about this early on, that there was some, what I want to say here, some admission of bias on Burke's part. And so he's just bringing some more things in here for us to see. And he quotes Whetten. Whetten talks about the what, the how, the why. What's the construct? How is the linkage? How we're going to be able to do this? Why we have to have some kind of an idea of why we want to do it. And of course, we're going to have to come out and tell people who, where, and when. Who's going to do it, where it's going to be done, and when it's going to be done. I notice they use here temporal and contextual factors, but I think that's where we fall into, especially the when part. When part. When are we going to do this? Now this is some more work here done by Porras. This is Porras and Silvers in 1991. This is the graphic for you, figure 7.3 in your text. Notice what it says. There's a plan, process, model of organization change. So we have both here, organization transformation, the two keys here, and then organization development. And then we get into the vision and the work setting. Then we have what these folks refer to as three types of change: alpha change, beta, and then gamma change, and behavior change, etc. So if we look at these, and these can be found starting on page 142 in your text, with the alpha change, is sort of a before and after result, a difference. We did this before, or we didn't do this before, we did this after, and you want to maybe to put this in a better way, so like a pre-test, post-test method. So we're gonna test somebody at the beginning. We're not going to give them anything. We're going to test on what their knowledge is. Then we're going to do, for lack of a better term, an intervention. And then once that intervention is done, we're going to test them again. And we're going to see what the difference is and if the difference is measurable. And we can obviously find out if people have learned, et cetera, et cetera. Beta, at least to me, is the change can be perceptual. And then in gamma, we're simply redefining. Alpha, beta, gamma, first three letters of the Greek alphabet. Now, this slide may be a little confusing here because it starts out by saying cognition, clicking in our brains, is necessary for envisioning where we're going, where we want to be after we get through with doing what we're going to do. But it is the behavior that's the focus of the change. Notice what these James and Lang theory, Wegner and Wheatley, cognition, engaging our brain, follows behavior. It's not the other way around. Not something we would normally think of. The other way around. Now, Burke gives us some current thinking. You might say 1999 is not real current. It is 16, 17 years old. Again, here we're back to talking about episodic change and continuous change. Notice that they say here that episodic change arises from inertia, where we are not doing anything, we're at a steady state. Whereas continuous change is done in response to the instability of organizations. Now, if you stop and think about this, it really is saying what we've been saying along. We talked about equilibrium and a few other things on this inertia. Here, what we're saying is we're making this change as a result of we realize that we're stuck in doing what we've been doing right along. We're not looking out beyond our boundaries and waking up and smelling the coffee, if you will, etc. Pardon me. Whereas continuous change, notice it says instability of an organization. So what I would pose to you, and I ask you to stop and think about this. Would we have continuous change when we're in a situation of equilibrium or inertia or entropy? All those words are synonymous as we're using them here. And my answer to that is yes, we would, because we would notice little things that need to be tinkered with or tweaked along the way. So we would do that, but that does not mean it's going to take us out of that state. But notice it says here instability. So if we're going to do continuous change, these folks are saying that we're probably unstable anyway. Perhaps unstable is better to say it here. And so we're going to do this continuous change. But in the long term, that's probably not going to get us out of this inertia. Now, Wick and Quinn, back to 1999, then applied Lewin's model, which we all know, the unfreezing movement, freezing, refreezing thing that Lewin developed back in the 1940s or 1950s. He was a little bit different thing. You notice they're using this to continuous change. Freeze, rebalance, refreeze. Now, what they're saying here is that if you look at Lewin talks about moving this freeze statement. So you take it out of this freeze and then you bring it into this unbalanced, or excuse me, this rebalanced area or this movement area. There's some different words that people use with Lewin's model. And then when you reach the stage that you want it to be, you freeze it. Now, I think a good way to think about this and something that we do on an everyday basis. Well, we may not do it, but we're familiar with it. Would be to open a package of gelatin. And it's going to stay in that granular state until we do something to it. And so we add liquid to that, and then it becomes in this rebalanced. It is now no longer a granule, a solid granule. It is in a liquid form. And we're going to stir that liquid form long enough until we dissolve all the granule. Now, I don't remember gelatin well enough to whether you add sugar or you don't add sugar, but let's say you add sugar or some type of sweetener, and you're going to continue that stirring process, or that agitation process, maybe is a better way to say that, until you get the gelatin, it's not gelatin now, get the liquid, pardon me, into a liquid form where everything is dissolved. And so now you've taken a package of granules, you've added fluid to it, you've changed it, and now you want to put it in the form that you want it, so you're going to freeze it. Normally, I think we take it and put it in the refrigerator, but it's irrelevant. Now, there's a couple other things that normally go with this. If we're going to put that in the refrigerator, while it's still liquid, we want it to be cool enough that it's not going to cause some problems with it in the refrigerator. So that's that rebalance. And then you get to this end state that you want it to be, and it's going to freeze. Well, that's going to become solidified. So here we're going to discuss this again, and a little bit different way of looking what Lewin had said. In the freeze as used by Oich and Quinn, notice what they're saying here is to find out what we're doing on a routine basis and to reinforce that. That's what we want to do. And their term rebalance means to eliminate obstacles so we can continuously change. So that would be to streamline the bureaucracy, cut out the other red tape, et cetera, so we can make these changes as we go along. Now, if you know anything about Kaizen, the Japanese approach to continuous change, that's embedded into their culture. And so they probably don't have to go through this reducing barriers, but that doesn't mean to say they don't. And then the unfreeze, actually, I think this really should be refreeze, but they're using the term unfreeze here, is to mean that we're open to new ideas. Now, that sounds like a little bit of a dichotomy when we talk about Lewin, and Lewin talks about refreezing because that's the end state that you want to reach. What they're saying here with continuous change is you don't have an end state that you want to reach because you are looking to continually change what you've been doing, or to change the product that you've made in some way that will be materially better for the consumer, although the consumer may not necessarily notice that. And because it's materially better for the consumer, it's probably less expensive for you, the manufacturer, because you've done some things to make things better. So this is a different approach from the Lewin's traditional model of taking something out, unfreezing it and then freezing it at the end. Because here we're talking about, pardon me, continuous change. Now, if you're talking about episodic or revolutionary change, I think you'd want to use the term refreeze because that's the end state you want to be in. Well, and we spent about the last, 40 plus minutes talking about chapter 17. It's 5:11. If you have any questions, please let me know. Otherwise, I will take a few minute break here, come back at about let's say 5:14, and we'll talk about chapter 18. Please come back 5:14. Thank you. All right, 5:14. We're going to get into chapter 8 now, and Burke is going to introduce us to what he calls conceptual models for understanding organization change. And I think that this first slide really is really kind of sums up what we've been talking about, that change is usually a response to some type of an event, especially when we think of change as being revolutionary. And talk about changes in the environment, and changes in the environment could be customers' buying patterns, it could be all sorts of type things. And then the leadership has to decide how is it that we want to respond to this change. And Burke introduces us to the well-known American management guru, Peter Drucker. And notice what Drucker says here. By the way, you can see Drucker's assumptions on page 169 in the text. Businesses get into trouble when their assumptions don't fit reality. You can read everything else in between there, and it's all important, and I'm not going to tell you it's not, but the bottom line is when what we assume is not what's true. And so that's where we get into trouble. That's where businesses get into trouble. That's where people who want to make change get into trouble because they're relying on their assumptions without making sure that their assumptions are accurate. Now, excuse me, uh, Burke cites Drucker by saying, uh, notice this, back to his quote on reality, we talked about that. You can see that on page 169 in your text. But for a valid theory, the three assumptions that he had, and by the way, I didn't go into each of those. They are on the slide. You can see them on page 169. And I said they're cut to the chase. They don't fit reality. Assumptions, again, must fit reality. They must mesh with each other. In other words, they can't be divergent. What we're going to do, the theory of the business has to be understood by everyone who's going to be involved, and it needs to be tested constantly. So in other words, what that means is not go back to the drawing board. What that means is here we have something now. Is this still the way we want to operate, or do we have to make change based upon the changing environment? I've mentioned to you, and I'm not a real expert on this, I mentioned to you about Kodak, who was a leading film producer in the United States and made cameras that many people of my generation grew up with. And I understand and have read that Kodak had the technology to make the changes to the way we take photographs today. And I'm not talking about professional photographer, but the way the average person takes pictures and captures them, and yet didn't do anything with that technology. So that's what we're talking about here, about testing the theory. Or it's one of the things we're talking about when we say testing the theory. This is a, hello? This is a paradox of success. And I think we need to stop and think about what this slide really says. We're looking to the past to predict future success. And we can look at the past with 20/20 vision because we know what happened. Or in the case of a company, it had the ability to make the history. And you know, the old saw that winners write history. And the history is viewed through the prism of the winner, not the loser. And that's what happens here. And if you are into the stock market in any way, shape, or form, you will get a prospectus from somebody trying to sell you stock or a mutual fund or something else. And one of the first things it will say to you is past performance is not an indicator of future performance. And that's exactly what this says. We get lulled to sleep, or we could get lulled to sleep by saying, oh, well, we've done this in the past, we've been very, very successful. So if we do this in the future, that success will follow. Well, that's just not true. Or as someone said in one of, I won't quote exactly what Gershwin's character said, it ain't necessarily so. Excuse the language. Now, here's how to change a theoretical framework. And there's a life cycle theory, teleological theory, dialectic theory, and an evolutionary theory. And in the life cycle, we're talking about phases. And if you look at the life cycle of a product, for instance, or maybe even a company, it goes through generation, and it goes through growth, and it gets to a position where it's dominant in its field, and then after a period of time, it slides down. Now, that doesn't follow all the way through, because I like to use a product called Tide detergent. Now, by the way, it's made by Procter & Gamble. Procter & Gamble's a Fortune 500 company. It's headquartered here in Cincinnati. I don't own any stock, so what I'm going to say is coming from me, not influenced by ownership. Tide laundry detergent has been on the market for 60 or more years, more than 60 years. And the last I knew, it was still the #1 selling laundry detergent, I think, not only in the United States, but internationally. It probably couldn't stay that way if it hadn't continually done some type of change. Now, does it still clean clothes? Yeah. Does it still do some other things it's always done? Probably so, but they have gone through different ways of changing it, saying we're going to add bleach, and we're going to do this, and we're going to do that to make it better. And so that's what life cycle doesn't always follow this startup, growth, maturity. I didn't use that term before, but that's what I meant, maturity, when you're at the top of your game, and then usually a slow decline. We do know products that have happened to that. VCS tape, audio cassettes, and things of that nature. You can still get them, but they've been long surpassed by other type things. Teleological theory, continuous adaptation. Dialectic talks about conflict. And then, of course, we know what evolutionary theory is. Now, here is table 8.1, which you can see in your texts. And notice at the top, they use the key metaphor, life cycle, teleological, dialectic, evolutionary. And then they show event progression. And under life cycle, not exactly the way I explained it, but they talked about it's linear, and that it is an irreversible sequence of prescribed stages. Now, that I agree to. Most products move through that. I would not say linear. Most of the things that I've seen, it tends to be on a curve. And you could even think of it in some respects as being like a bell-shaped curve to help you figuratively visualize that. It's not actually a bell-shaped curve, but it kind of looks that way. And that's that growth. Well, that's initiation at the bottom, then growth, and then maturity, and then decline, and then obviously demise at the end. And I'm not going to go through all of these things, but I think it's a very good way to look at that once we've talked about it, and then to look at the table and look at the metaphors that are used for the various things, life cycle, organic growth, theological, purposeful cooperation, dialectic opposition and conflict, and then evolutionary competitive survival. And then look at how that is described by these authors, Van de Veen and Poole. And I think once we do that, that can really help us internalize what's being said. Now, this is a neat formula here, I think, and it's easy to understand and to, I think, keep in our memories. So we have change, and then the change is plus A, B, and D, and then less than X, or greater than. So A being the level of dissatisfaction with what's happening now. and let's not even say dissatisfaction. Let's say, well, we really don't like what this is. We're not really dissatisfied, but we really think we need to go someplace else. Understanding where you want to go. It's not fuzzy. Where you want to be. And then having some idea of how to get started. It used to be, if you wanted to take a trip, you got a map from someone. And now you go to Google or some other search engine and you say, okay, I'm starting from here, 4th and Plum, and I want to go to New York City. How do I get there? And then the other thing always has to be considered is the cost of change. And you have to make sure that you calculate that so that somebody doesn't come up and say, this is going to cost us too much money. Change is never inexpensive. And so that has to be calculated from the very beginning. Now, here we're going back to talking about in different fashions, and this is Lewin's 3 steps expanded. This work was done by Lippitt, Watson, and Wesley in 1958, not too long or not too many years after Lewin came up with his his model. Steps, some people call them phases. So you're developing it, you say, okay, we need to change. And that's the unfreezing portion. Next, notice what they've talked about. We've talked about this in different manners, making sure that there's a relationship between the change agent and, it says here client organization, but let's say the employees. I think all of us can say without fear of doubt that when we've experienced change, the person who was to lead the change, if there was some suspicion about that person, whatever it happened to be, the change probably was going to be met with resistance. Now we're going to start working toward the change. This is that moving, that changing direction. So we're in this middle state. We've gotten to where we want to be, and now we're going to stabilize the change. We're going to freeze it, keep it where it needs to be, because we've reached the state where we want to be. And then notice what it says down here at the end. Something I really have a little problem with the way it's put. Terminating the change agent. Well, I don't think you're really going to do that. I think you're going to say to the change agent, you've done a good job, thank you. Now you can go back to what you've been doing before. I don't like that term termination, but in essence, that's what it is. He or she is ending what they have been doing. Now this talks about organization change as transition. And I really think we need to think about this all the time, because we're in state 1, which is where we don't want to be. We want to go to state 2 or 3 or whatever happens to be where we want to go. So once we've determined we're going to make the change, we are in transition. And we have to think about it that way. But we have to think about it this way. Once we've started the transition, we're not going back to where we were. And I think that's something we really need to keep in mind. We're not going back. So future state, where is it we want to be? Present state, we know where we are. At least I hope we know where we are, or we should know where we are. And then this transition, what is it that we need to do? What are the activities and the events that have to happen to get us from current state to future state? So we're in transition, and we need to realize that we're in transition. And to go back to something that Burke introduced us to a long time ago, is that change and the way change happens is not linear. So we need to make sure that we keep that in our minds and are in this transition. We may not be going, and probably won't go in a straight line. Now, here he brings up a different model. Again, this is a person by the name of Bridges. Notice what it says here at the first, that this is intended for people, but it can be applied to organizations. Endings, we got to let go. And we talked about that just on the last slide. We're not going back to where we were. The neutral zone, I guess we could look at the neutral zone as being the transition period, the transition zone. We aren't where we used to be, but we're not where we want to be. And then the new beginnings. And that's a whole raft of things. It's not just the organization, it's the employees, etc. Now here, Burke brings in individual emphasis, and he talks about Maslow's and Hertzberg's needs there. We know what Maslow is, this hierarchical of needs. Actually, is a pyramid, broad base at the bottom up to the top, with the top one being self-actualization. As I remember, Maslow says we're always striving for self-actualization, but we're probably never going to reach it. Now, back off from that just a second. Doesn't mean to say we won't reach something that we're trying to get to, but there's always going to be something else. Hertzberg's two-factor theory talks about the difference between job content and job context. It's the content of the job, according to Hertzberg, it's more important. Things that we do gives us a responsibility and authority and way to do things. He mentions Victor Vroom's expectancy theory. And if you're not familiar with the expectancy theory, or you don't remember the expectancy theory, this is motivation equals expectancy times instrumentality times valence. Let's not worry too much about those things, but it's the employee exerts work effort to achieve the task and hopefully to successfully perform the task. And then he or she realizes what he or she has done is either the work-related outcomes and is the reward worth the effort that was put into it. So that's what expectancy is. Are we going to achieve what we want to achieve? Is it worth what we put into it? Job satisfaction by Hacker and Oldman, that really kind of follows along with some of the tenets of Hertzberg. And job satisfaction is such things as having skill identity and responsibility and skill identity, and where we're actually in charge of doing something, and then getting feedback. I know I left one or two thoughts out, but then getting feedback on how well we've done and what it is we need to do, continue doing what we've been doing, and then how to increase performance. And then I think everybody knows about Skinner. Skinner's positive reinforcement simply says if you want a particular trait to be continued, that you tell people how well they've done and continue to do things in that nature. And that way, the person will continue to do the things that you want him or her to do simply because of the positive reinforcement. Now, organizations also change. Notice here we're talking about now the group emphasis, or as I like to say more often, the team emphasis. Lewin, Changing Values Through the Group by Chris Argyris, and then the Group Unconscious by Bion. Now we'll look at these. Let me go back just a second, if you don't mind. All right, let me expand a little bit on this. I thought I had something else on the slide and I didn't have it. That's my fault. Lewin, these change norms, change now, eliminate resistance, and take ownership. That's what should be the group focus of change. Chris Argyes, I should say, used McGregor's X and Y. I think we know McGregor's X and Y. McGregor's X says that managers believe that employees don't like to work and they have to be coerced to work, and the only reason they're going to work is because they get paid, and the fear of getting fired is what keeps them on the job as well. Theory Y says that that's not true, that people like to work just as much as they like to have leisure time, et cetera. They like to have their brains engaged, et cetera, et cetera. What Argyes is talking about here is that the manager or leader espouses theory espouses theory Y, but actually acts as theory X. And so that's what he's talking about, the changing of values, and eliminate the confusion, is what Argyes is saying. And then beyond here is talking about authority. Now, in the larger group would be the organization. And participative management, Likert says that's the one best way you get everybody involved. Lawrence and Lorsch says it really all depends. What they're saying is depends upon the situation. There's other people who are into that situational leadership, as well as Hersey and Blanchard and a few others. And then Levinson looks at the organization as a family. Now, if we go back and look at this, it's table 8-2. This brings us back to some of the folks that we were talking about before, Maslow and Hertzberg, the theorist, the content emphasis, the process application, Broom and Lawler, Hackman and Ullman, and Skinner. And then with the group, we have Lewin, and then we have Argyes. So that gives us some kind of an idea, and that kind of, again, graphically explains what we tried to explain without the graphics. Excuse me. And then continue with table 8-2 is beyond, and then the larger systems, Likert, Lawrence and Lorsch, and then Levinson. And again, trying to help us visualize what we were saying and kind of bring things together so it's greater clarity. Now, at the macro level, content and process of strategic change in organizations. There are two schools of thought, Plan and Spritzer. The content school, which is, as we know, talks about what do we have here, and then the process school talks about how are we going to do this. Notice what this says down here. Even though these two are interdependent, related, they've evolved differently, independently. And notice what they're saying down here. Because of this, we have some theoretical and practical gaps in understanding strategic change. So we have to make sure we're going to do this, that we have the what is it we want to do, and the how are we going to do this together. It can't be separated. If they're separated, we're going to have issues. Strategies, and notice here again, it's saying it can be either related to content or process, but when we're involving humans, we're talking more about process. It's the how, not the what. Now, that does not mean the what is still not important. It is important. But we have to address both together. And then these are Chin and Bainey's 3 strategies for planned change. Now, we've talked a little bit about some of this before, but let's just discuss it. This is our last slide, but I want to make sure that we get this and think about it again, even though we've discussed it in the past. Empirical, rational, normative, reductive, power, coercive. Now, as you know, I don't like the power coercive because you're causing people to do things that they may not willingly want to do. And you're doing that because you have the power to control their destiny being whether they continue to work for the organization or not. The rational approach says that people are going to do things when it's in their rational self-interest. We have to be careful about that. We have to make sure that they see that it is in their rational self-interest. Everybody's rational self-interest doesn't work the same way. I'll give you a classic example. People have said that the stock market would not act in certain ways because of its rational self-interest. Well, stock market's made up of a number of different players, and everybody doesn't have the same level of rational self-interest. So we have a problem there right from the beginning. Normative reductive. Notice here what they're saying, that conforming to norms has a stronger pull than trying to appeal to someone's rational thought process, their logical thought process. So what this is saying is, think of this as gravitational. And you're working within an organization and there are certain norms and you want to stay within those norms. Go back to the Hawthorne experiments, the bank wiring room, where there were norms in place for how much was produced each day. And when an individual exceeded the norms, he was held to ridicule. Now I say he because that was all men in that particular experiment. Not only was held to ridicule, became the subject of ridicule. So norms and staying within the norms and want to being a conformist is going to make us is going to exert greater pressure on us than appeals to rationality. Now, is that across the board? Well, probably not, but it's probably closer to being across the board than it isn't. That brings us to the end of what I have to present this evening. And the question I want to pose is, if you go back to page 142, starting on page 142, there are 3 different I've lost my train of thought here. 3 different types of change that the author brings up here that he's referring to: alpha, beta, and gamma. Please review each of these 3 and then determine in your own estimation which of the 3 has greater importance. And be sure to support your reasoning for which of the 3 has greater importance: alpha change, beta change, or gamma change. So look at them, see what their differences are, and determine which of the 3 that you think is the most important and why. So I thank you for your attention tonight. I will have this uploaded for you tomorrow, and then send you the link to YouTube. Thank you and good night.